Agatha Christie's Death on the Nile by Microids is a narrative driven detective adventure that reimagines the original story from 1937 and moves it into 1970s, doubles its investigative perspective with two different detectives, and layers modern detective game systems, mind mapping, crime scene reconstruction, and tailing and eavesdropping onto that familiar closed circle murder aboard the SS Karnak. It launches on September 25th for the PS5, Xbox Series X and S, Nintendo Switch, and PC. Death on the Nile is a third-person mystery-flavored clue buffet where you bounce between two detectives like Agatha Christie's own buddy cop pitch to HBO. One is Detective Perot, the mustache cerebral cortex maljudgment machine. The other is Jane Royce, a newly minted private investigator who's less pipe and ponder and more lock, pick, and leap. Death on the Nile is a game with a two protagonist story and isn't really what I expected, but it does break the expected story tradition and original plot and works with the change to the 1970s, as well as the spreading out of different characters. And it works better than I expected, especially with the game's more flexible handling of the time between crimes than we see in other titles. Each mission bleeds into the next, with sometimes some of the same characters months later in another case, and their lives having changed. The less I say, the better. But a fantastic idea is to have something like this where it feels like less 12 things happening in 12 days and instead showing or at least explaining the test of time. As a third-person detective game, if you played any of the Sherlock Holmes consulting detective titles or similar investigative adventures, Death on the Nile is going to feel pretty much familiar. This is a game where slow burn sleuthing takes center stage. You'll comb through environments, examine objects, rotate them in your hand like you're about to ask them existential questions, and quiz suspects with a dialogue system that gives you a trio of topics per conversation. But the aim's always the same: poke holes in stories, connect motives to opportunity, and extract just enough extra detail to move the case forward. Each thread eventually feeds into Perot's mental deduction board, a visual web of puzzle pieces representing clues. The system lets you connect paired facts to build logical conclusions. A pretty elegant mechanic that mixes intuition with a bit of light puzzling. These deduction segments also occasionally turn into more hands-on tasks, small puzzle mini-games that add interactivity without actually turning the whole thing into a friggin' reflex test. As the web of information expands around you, things can get a little bit more dense and require more tracking. The game tracks everybody with some connections to the case and fills out a dedicated profile card for each. And it's actually a surprisingly effective system. For example, when talking to people, you log their full names, relationships to the crime, occupation, and discovered secrets. And crucially, you're not just passively receiving all this, you actively input it. The game confirms what you've got right, which reinforces a bit of retention here and makes the characters feel more concrete in your memory because you're the one actually putting it down. You're just picking a first name from a first name list like a character generator, but by doing a couple of those, it actually solidifies the person's face to their name. It's a clever touch. While many mystery games love flashy UI clutter and overly dramatic clue revelations, Death on the Nile leans a bit more towards subtle reinforcement. That character card system in particular, as I said, doubles as a nice, soft hint tool. One thing becomes clear early on, though. The game is not going to solve itself, even on easy. If you're zoning out while someone's recounting their alibi, you're going to miss something. Case in point, mid-conversation with one suspect, I started filling out another character's profile card for just a second, only to have a mental firework quietly pop off, and something clicked. A previous assumption that I had had began to unravel, and suddenly a seemingly minor comment reshaped a detail that I thought and I had pinned down hours before. It's that kind of game, that kind of reward and focus that gently punishes autopilot thinking, but at the same time really does end up feeling more flexible than a lot of other game systems. As you work through the conversations, the game does the favor of indicating when a discussion thread has been fully mined, at least on particular difficulties. It's subtle, but it's pretty helpful, especially early on when you're just still figuring out the rhythm and what the game may want from you. That said, also, if you want a pure detective experience, there's a difficulty option that strips away pretty much all of this. For people who are just starting out, though, I'd recommend starting with the lower difficulty for that first case. With the character cards, branching dialogue, and layered deductions, it can feel a bit dense for where you go, who you need to talk to, and what you need to do. Once you do that, though, there's a pretty solid argument to be made for dialing the challenge up. The writing in this is actually tight, the character interactions are pretty deliberate, and the structure's robust enough that you're rarely really flailing around for directions or bumping into stuff just hoping something happens. In these type of games, there's usually one standout mechanic. So for example, Sherlock Holmes and its neuron firing mind palace looks like somebody turned cognitive psychology into a Marvel computer UI. But in Death on the Nile, The real star is actually how it handles crime scene reconstruction. This is awesome. You don't just read about what happens and build your timeline from there. When you've gathered enough evidence, the game lets you physically position characters in specific spots in time around the crime scene, aligned to where every event occurred. 10:48, one person's in the hallway. 11 o'clock, somebody's coming out of a room. At 12 o'clock, somebody's coming out of a room with another somebody they shouldn't be with, and they're hoping somebody else doesn't catch them. And you're dragging and dropping these characters into places based on the statements you've heard and the details you've collected that were accurate. It's essentially spatial logic turned into gameplay. It works remarkably well. It's not just cosmetic either. In my first case, I had a rough idea of what happened fairly early. About 75% of it sort of came together. But the minute I began placing characters around the environment and seeing how their positions lined up with the timeline, I realized I knew exactly what happened, but I had some just different ideas about what it looked like in 3D space. Names and times, vague clues, they all stopped feeling like scattered notes at that point and started forming this coherent 3D picture, and in fact, almost a 3D movie. That kind of mental framing that the game expects, knowing it after the tutorial case, means that each case after that, you sort of know you're going to hit that point, and you can start to identify what you need to know to put it all together. Visually, Death on the Nile leads very, very hard on the stylized approach. It's a mix of cell shading and satirized disco era flair that wouldn't feel out of place in something like No One Lives Forever, the John Travolta edition. It's bold, yes, and colorful, and it's clearly not chasing photorealism. The aesthetic choice lets the game highlight some very specific visual details and character expressions, location markers, mood lighting, without forcing your eyes to linger on every low poly background asset or soft textured walls. That also means, though, it can look ancient as hell in some of the sets. Now, there's a definite charm here, but it is absolutely not a game that you're going to say, man, this is pushing whatever engine it's on. Performance-wise, that's also good, though. If you're packing a 2080 or newer, you're golden for well above 60. The game isn't particularly demanding, even when rendering some of the larger late-game environments or larger areas that you're trying to collect clues from. There are the occasional frame dips and sprawling locations, nothing egregious unless you're playing on very low-end hardware. It runs well, and importantly, it runs pretty consistently, something I can say that not every stylized game has pulled off. That said, that visual style is not going to be for everybody. It has a deliberately older game feel to it, sometimes almost nostalgic, other times borderline dated. You walk past a parked car and think to yourself, that is every design choice or remnant from a game built in 2009 if I've ever seen it. But one thing that's not laid back is their audio. So for a game with a lot of crimes and trying to put people away for dimes, I actually enjoyed a lot of the voices. Different characters have different inflections, and surprisingly and honestly, profoundly, I am thankful for this, the idea that the characters don't immediately come across as guilty when they talk. Characters do not immediately tip their hand at all. Some sound cagey, others don't. Others sound straightforward and aren't. And occasionally someone sounds exactly how you expect a liar to sound, just not about the thing that you thought it was. If you get a chance, leave a comment. We'll be giving away a copy of the game to a random commenter. I would love for you to leave a comment. Also, remember Silent Hill, and in the next couple days, a Ghost review. Let's talk about the fun factor. The game suffers from two problems. I'm covering problems first because a lot of it was fun, but I just want to cover these because they did bother me. First, so basically, you can get close to people. You can talk to them, or you can get somewhat close to people, and you can sometimes eavesdrop, but you can only sometimes eavesdrop. And sometimes the eavesdrop distance is different vastly on the right side or the left side of a character, even if the eavesdrop location is in front of the friggin' people. Then the whisker-thin area to eavesdrop, at least get the activation notice, makes you feel like no one in the goddamn world would notice a 50-year-old walrus mustached man in a tan suit walking back and forth past two women poolside and think anything other than kidnapping threat high. And I mean it, some of these are razor tight locations, and some don't make any goddamn sense at all. No lie, one is so far away the main character might as well have just bought a friggin' bullhorn and thrown it to the suspects and said, hey, could you please scream into this? Also, because of how the story plays out on a number of crimes and their culprits who go unannounced for way longer than I would have liked, that breaks into the actual storyline with reasons that are not identified for why some crimes or some criminals did what they did. Not only does that stretch the line of realism, it just flat out sucks. One mission has you get ready and tell someone about what your 3 hours of hard-earned sweat, blood, and tears has resulted in, stressing over every word cipher, risking your life, hiding from a possible murderer, sneaking into at least 4 areas you shouldn't, resulting in the criminal basically getting caught red-handed and then being told not to tell someone because it would hurt everybody's feelings. Listen, I take this shit serious. That's why I accosted some old lady at a swimming pool about her nocturnal habits and frisked someone's suitcase like I thought Carl Frederick was the name of a favorite sex toy. It pissed me off having that happen. It doesn't happen every time, but getting success pulled out of your hands a couple times, or at least recognition, does not feel great, even if it ends up paying off across the story proper. That being said, solving the crimes, Jesus, it is profoundly fun. The puzzling, the clues, actually, not only are they fun, but incredibly complex sometimes. And then going through a timeline to lodge each move down works so well. Some of the physical puzzles are awesome and fit within the game's framework so well, it's actually a bit nuts. I loved a particular puzzle involving a jukebox that I needed to make work to get a character to talk. It had multiple parts, many pieces, required a bit of 3D thinking as well as pattern analysis and guesswork. It was just a blast. Also, huge bonus to the game, and let's be honest, if it wasn't, the game would suck. That's how the characters are handled across time. Not every character in Death on the Nile is a standout. Some are compelling, others feel like they wandered in from a canceled BBC drama, but the blend works surprisingly well across time. Honestly, the fact that not every NPC is a walking charisma fountain actually helps. It sharpens your focus and it stops you from chasing charm and start chasing relevance. Perot and Royce generally operate separately, but a lot of it's alike. They share a central case log that consolidates all the filings that you've done on the different people. It's a communal database, think murder mystery Slack channel. That allows both characters to pull from the same reservoir of notes, names, and observations, grounding the game in a kind of procedural realism most titles in the genre actually don't really bother chasing. It's subtle, it's also very effective. Coming out of Silent Hill, I didn't know what to think of Death of the Nile, and let's be honest here, graphically, it is a step behind. Even when the lower end stylized graphics are there, it just still has a ton of gumshoe gameplay. And even after completing it, I found clues that I hadn't found and smaller mysteries I hadn't solved in cases that made me leaping back in to either identify those to just figure out the story plot, to figure out a cipher that I didn't need to figure out to understand the main overall story, as well as go back and get some collectibles. Let's be honest, the collectibles are just different versions of golden mustaches, which is weird, but I actually found myself doing it. While it is true that the main character isn't as interesting as, say, Sherlock Holmes or others, but the idea that you stick within the cases, and sure, they're not supernatural or anything like that, they're just really good gumshoe detective cases. And for me, that made the game absolutely worth getting. Hugely enjoyed my time with this, and plan on actually going back and experiencing some of it. But I got to give you some caveats, man. Those graphics, damn, they rough. Also, when you're playing this game, there will be times where you're like, I don't necessarily know what to do or where to exactly go, especially if you have that difficulty cranked up. I'm telling you, look over your notes. It does a great job of making sure that you know it, even if you have to comb through some stuff. So while this might only be for fans of the detective genre, which this one pretty much is, and probably won't bring in a bunch of new people, I gotta say, if you are a fan, you're probably gonna stay one or become an even bigger one after playing it. Peace out, everybody. Subscribe, check out the podcast this Friday, 10:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on the Best Gaming Podcast YouTube channel. That's it for me. Enjoy.